You are holding your breath in the pitch-black, freezing dark, praying your own shivering does not betray you. The air in the narrow wooden closet smells of dried lavender and stale terror. Outside the heavy oak door, the slow, deliberate drag of an iron key scrapes against the stone corridor. This is not a nightmare, and it is not a fairy tale. It is December of 1610, deep inside the walls of Csejte Castle in the Kingdom of Hungary, and the footsteps echoing in the hall are entirely real. Catalin presses her 15-year-old frame against the back of the linen closet, her eyes wide, staring at nothing in the absolute dark.
Beside her, another girl is weeping without making a sound, her tears freezing on her pale cheeks. Catalin's singular goal tonight is simply to remain invisible until the sun rises. The heavy boots stop directly outside their door. They belong to Ilona Yo, the highest-ranking nursemaid of the estate and the chief enforcer for its aristocratic master. The two girls are hiding because of a single, minuscule mistake made hours earlier by the grand fireplace. A silver sewing needle had slipped from trembling fingers and clattered onto the polished floor during evening embroidery. To the lady of the castle, this was no mere accident or sign of fatigue. It was a profound disrespect, a failure of the courtly refinement they were brought here to learn. The punishment for such an infraction in this household is never a simple scolding. The older servants whisper of a quiet, permanent discipline from which no girl ever returns. The heavy iron latch of the closet door begins to lift with an agonizing groan. The psychological weight of the moment is paralyzing. It is the raw, suffocating helplessness of the powerless waiting for absolute authority to strike. The door creaks open, slicing the darkness with a thin sliver of orange torchlight. A towering shadow falls directly over Catalin's face. She closes her eyes, bracing for the inevitable end. A cold hand, heavy with jeweled rings, reaches into the claustrophobic space. But the hand does not grab Catalin. It seizes the trembling girl beside her, dragging her out into the flickering light. The door slams shut, leaving Catalin alone in the terrifying dark, listening to the fading sounds of her companion being pulled down into the lower cellars.
Just a few days later, on the freezing night of December 30th, 1610, the heavy timber gates of Csejte Castle were violently splintered open by armed cavalry. Georgi Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary and the highest-ranking official in the realm, rode into the courtyard with a detachment of soldiers to finally halt the whispered horrors. They did not find a supernatural lair. They did not find a mystical vampire bathing in vats of crimson to preserve her youth. What Thurzo's men actually discovered was far more disturbing, precisely because it was deeply, methodically human. According to the official records of the raid, soldiers sweeping the lower holding rooms uncovered a grim, silent house of shadows. They found young women locked away in the freezing dark, severely deprived of food and bearing the marks of systematic, prolonged cruelty. Outside, beneath the frost-hardened earth of the estate, they found the hastily buried remains of those who had failed to survive the winter. This was the estate of Countess Elizabeth Bathory, the wealthiest and most powerful woman in the nation. For over 2 decades, hundreds of young girls had vanished behind these stone walls. It stands as one of the most staggering and prolonged series of crimes in recorded history. But the sheer scale of the vanished immediately presents a massive, haunting question. If you find yourself drawn to the dark, forgotten corners of history, where the truth is far more terrifying than the myths, make sure to subscribe and join us as we uncover the rest of this story, because the central mystery of Csejte Castle defies all logic. How does a prominent aristocrat operate a localized vanishing campaign, wiping out an estimated 300 young women in one of the most famous fortresses in Europe for 20 years without anyone stopping her? The sensationalized legends born decades later which claim she used dark magic or supernatural influence to hide her deeds from the world. But the historical truth is infinitely darker and heavily documented. Countess Bathory was not a creature of the night outsmarting the authorities. She was a deeply protected aristocrat who did not need to hide her actions, operating a vast enterprise of cruelty with the silent permission of the law.
To comprehend how a sprawling mechanism of human vanishing could operate openly in the late 16th century, we must examine the legal bedrock of the Kingdom of Hungary. According to the ancient laws of the realm, specifically the historical legal code known as the tripartitum, the social divide was absolute and insurmountable. Under this system, the peasant class, the serfs who worked the vast estates, were not considered citizens with rights or protections. In the cold, unfeeling eyes of the law, they were legally classified as property. If a noblewoman ended the life of a peasant, it was not categorized as a crime against humanity in any modern sense. It was legally equivalent to destroying her own livestock or damaging her own furniture. The state simply did not intervene in the disposal of a noble's property. This dark legal reality was amplified by a heavily ravaged socio-political landscape. Hungary was reeling from the devastating Long Turkish War, a conflict that left the countryside burned, impoverished, and desperate. Countless young girls were orphaned, roaming the frozen, barren villages in search of basic sustenance. In this landscape of starvation, the towering stone walls of Csejte Castle offered a warm, wealthy refuge. It was a perfectly baited trap, disguised as salvation. The documentary revealed chillingly how the logistics of extreme cruelty were entirely normalized. The bodies of the lower class could be quietly removed from existence with zero legal consequence, so long as they belonged to the Countess's estate. The law protected Bathory flawlessly, shielding her darkest impulses behind a wall of absolute feudal immunity. The system worked exactly as it was designed, silently permitting the horror as long as she only hunted the peasants. But absolute power, when left unchecked in the dark, breeds an insatiable escalation.
Let us step back 2 years prior, long before the raid and before the terrifying silence of the linen closet. The heavy wooden doors of Csejte Castle open to welcome young Katalin, who arrives not as a prisoner, but as a privileged guest. Her immediate goal in the autumn of 1608 is to master the intricate rules of courtly etiquette, hoping to secure a prestigious marriage for her lesser noble family. Stepping inside, the castle is overwhelmingly opulent. The grand halls smell heavily of expensive imported oils, beeswax, and roasting meats, a jarring, vibrant contrast to the starving, war-torn countryside she just left behind. Katalin is proudly enrolled in the Gymnasium, the Countess's exclusive and prestigious finishing school, designed specifically for the daughters of the lesser nobility. For the first few weeks, the atmosphere is one of intense refinement. The girls sit together by the grand roaring fires, practicing French and mastering their intricate embroidery. Here, the silver sewing needle is a shining symbol of their elevated status, an instrument of grace, education, and civilized society. Yet a creeping psychological dread slowly begins to infect the opulent halls. It starts with microscopic details Katalin cannot quite ignore. She notices the way the older peasant maids violently flinch whenever the rustle of Bathory's silk skirts approaches the doorway. Then come the quiet, unexplained absences. A peasant girl serving the upper tables is reported to have fallen ill overnight, and she is never seen again. Beneath the heavy scent of perfumes, strange, sharp, metallic odors occasionally waft up from the iron grates leading down into the lower cellars. The castle's luxurious facade is slipping, revealing the cold, mechanical reality operating just beneath the floorboards. One evening, surrounded by the warmth of the fire, the suffocating pressure of perfection finally breaks. Katalin's hand trembles in exhaustion, and she makes a tiny, visible error in her delicate stitching. The Countess approaches slowly, her face composed and radiating a terrifying, maternal warmth. She reaches down, gently taking the silver needle from Katalin's rigid hand. Leaning close, she softly whispers that true discipline requires a permanent lesson. To understand the sheer mechanical efficiency of Csejte Castle, we must map the geography of its dark enterprise. This was not the chaotic frenzy of a solitary mind, but a highly organized, heavily insulated conspiracy managed by an inner circle of loyal accomplices. According to the surviving transcripts of the 1611 tribunals, the operation relied on specific, trusted individuals. There was the head nursemaid, Ilona Yo, a fiercely loyal servant named Dorka, and a physically deformed retainer known as Fitzko, who collectively maintained a strict compartmentalization of the estate. The upper floors of the fortress were kept impeccably pristine, projecting the flawless illusion of high aristocratic society to visiting dignitaries. Yet, just beneath their feet, the subterranean chambers had been quietly retrofitted into heavily insulated holding rooms, designed to ensure that the agonies below never disturbed the banquets above.
But a localized vanishing campaign of this magnitude cannot remain entirely invisible to the outside world. In the surrounding villages, the terrifying number of unmarked graves multiplying in the frozen earth began to draw the attention of a local Lutheran minister named Istvan Magyari. Realizing the staggering scale of the devastation, Magyari began drafting frantic, detailed letters, sending them directly to the royal court in Vienna. The contemporary records prove that the highest authorities in the land were explicitly warned, the evidence of a systemic slaughter mounting in plain sight. The king received the minister's desperate pleas, fully aware of the shadows growing in the Bathory estate, yet he did absolutely nothing to intervene, raising a disturbing question of why the crown would protect a predator. We return to the freezing inner chambers of Csejte in the bitter winter of 1609, where Catiline's immediate goal is simply to avoid drawing the Countess's eye. A profound and terrifying shift has taken hold of the household, altering the very air of the estate. The supply of local peasant girls has completely dried up, as terrified villagers have begun hiding their daughters in the forests or smuggling them out of the region entirely. Deprived of her usual victims, Bathory's behavior grows deeply erratic, her withdrawal manifesting as a suffocating, unpredictable rage that terrorizes the halls. It is here that the entire reality of Catiline's survival shatters, fundamentally reframing everything she thought she knew about the castle's ecosystem. Catiline is not a peasant servant. She is the daughter of a nobleman, possessing a privileged bloodline she believed guaranteed her absolute safety. Until this moment, the lesser noble girls enrolled in the prestigious finishing school assumed the horrors of the lower cellars were reserved strictly for the lower classes. It was a grim, unspoken reality of their brutal feudal world, but one that supposedly would never touch them. But as Catiline watches Bathory turn her cold, hollow gaze toward the aristocratic students, the true nightmare finally crystallizes. The unwritten laws of their society have been violently broken, as Bathory's dark compulsions finally eclipse her aristocratic caution. A sickening realization washes over Catiline, entirely changing her understanding of that terrible night hidden in the suffocating darkness of the linen closet. The trembling girl who was violently dragged out into the torchlight by Ilona Yo was not a peasant maid at all. It was Catiline's own noble-born cousin. The hunt has officially moved to the upper class, and the invisible shield of nobility has completely vanished.
To understand why the highest power in the land remained entirely complicit through inaction, we must step away from the freezing corridors of Csejte and look to the royal court of King Matthias II. The massive, unresolved mystery of this era has always been why a ruling monarch would deliberately ignore the systemic vanishing of aristocratic daughters. The answer, buried in the financial ledgers and political correspondence of the early 17th century, lies entirely in sovereign debt and volatile geopolitics. The Bathory family possessed a staggering accumulation of wealth, controlling vast territories that dwarfed the financial reserves of the Hungarian crown itself. King Matthias II was deeply, overwhelmingly in debt to Countess Elizabeth, having borrowed heavily to finance his military campaigns. To publicly prosecute the most powerful woman in the kingdom meant instantly destabilizing the region and risking an immediate civil war with Transylvania, a fiercely independent territory her family heavily influenced. Contemporary scholars now understand that the royal silence was not a matter of disbelief, but a cold, calculated strategy of statecraft. Justice was entirely subordinate to economics, revealing a chilling reality where human lives were weighed directly against the stability of the crown. The king turned a blind eye because confronting the monster in Csejte Castle simply cost too much money. It was only when the lesser nobility, the very families whose daughters were now vanishing into the lower cellars, began to realize the truth that the political calculus finally shifted. These families formed the backbone of the king's military forces, and they threatened a violent revolt if the crown continued to protect the predator hunting their bloodline. Forced into a corner by his own military commanders, King Matthias II finally had to act. He secretly dispatched his highest official, Palatine George Terzau, to intervene and shut down the operation. But this royal mandate was severely compromised from the moment it was issued. The king provided Terzau with a highly specific, fundamentally corrupt caveat regarding the Countess's ultimate fate, ensuring that even in its pursuit of justice, the crown would protect its own investments. It is the final, bitter weeks of December 1610, and the walls of Csejte Castle have become a freezing, suffocating trap. Cataline's immediate, desperate goal is to smuggle a single letter out of the fortress before she becomes the next permanent resident of the subterranean holding rooms. She is half-starved, her breath pluming in the frigid air of her quarters as she huddles beneath a thin wool blanket, listening to the agonizingly slow patrol of guards outside her door. Here, the central motif of her courtly education reaches its absolute, darkest iteration. Catiline holds a stolen silver sewing needle, no longer an instrument of aristocratic refinement, but her final desperate tool for survival. With trembling hands, she uses the sharp silver point to pierce her own skin, drawing enough dark warmth to hurriedly draft a tiny, frantic plea for salvation on a torn scrap of linen. The psychological terror of this act is agonizing. Every shifting shadow cast by the flickering candle flame morphs into the towering silhouette of Ilona Yo. Every sudden gust of winter wind rattling the heavy window panes sounds exactly like the heavy drag of Bathory's silk dress gliding across the stone floorboards. The following morning, moving like a ghost through the grand halls, Catiline manages to press the blood-stained scrap of linen into the palm of a sympathetic guardsman heading for the outer gates. But her momentary spark of hope is instantly extinguished. Before she can retreat to the safety of the upper floors, heavy hands seize her arms from behind, violently pulling her into the shadows of the antechamber. She has been caught by the Countess's inner circle, and the unwritten rules of the castle demand immediate, absolute discipline. Catiline is dragged relentlessly toward the heavy iron doors of the lower cellars, her heels sliding against the polished stone, fully aware that no one has ever returned from the dark depths below. The heavy cellar door groans open, revealing the pitch-black abyss and the faint metallic scent of the vanished. Just as the iron hinges begin to swing shut, sealing Catiline away forever, a massive, deafening sound erupts from the courtyard above. It is the sound of heavy timber splintering, followed immediately by the chaotic, thundering shouts of armed men breaching the castle gates.
The breach of Csejte Castle saved Catiline and the fragile handful of survivors remaining in the lower darkness. But the profound injustice of this systemic nightmare was far from over. If we examine the surviving transcripts from the Csejte courthouse in 1611, the legal fallout reveals a chilling final act of feudal corruption. During the proceedings, investigators documented the agonizing sworn testimonies of over 300 witnesses. Local clergy, terrified villagers, and surviving servants painted a meticulous terrestrial picture of a localized vanishing campaign that had operated in plain sight for decades. Yet, because of her immense wealth and her untouchable aristocratic bloodline, Elizabeth Bathory was never formally put on trial. She was never permitted to testify on the public record, nor was she ever forced to face the ultimate penalty of the law. Instead, the full, uncompromising weight of the state fell entirely upon her subordinates. Accomplices like Ilona Yo, Dorka, and Fitzko were subjected to the severest royal interrogations until their spirits broke, before being publicly erased from existence as convenient, lower-class scapegoats. To avoid a catastrophic public scandal and permanently protect the sovereign debts owed to her family, the Countess was simply quietly walled up inside her own chambers at Csejte. She was neutralized, but this deliberate state cover-up inadvertently birthed a monster that would obscure the historical truth for centuries. Today, the modern ruins of Csejte Castle sit silently above the surrounding villages, blanketed by the heavy winter snow. It is here that we must confront the legacy of the vanished and the deliberate, centuries-long erasure of their true history. Scholars now understand that the sensationalized folklore of a vampire bathing in the life force of her victims was entirely invented by Jesuit academics nearly a century after the castle gates were sealed. It was a calculated myth designed to moralize a highly political narrative and distract from the profound, systemic failures of the state. This monstrous legend remains a deeply comforting lie for modern society. It is infinitely easier to believe in the supernatural influence of a solitary dark creature than to confront the freezing, mechanical reality of our own history. The true darkness of Csejte was not born of magic, but of profound human apathy.
It was a fully functional legal and economic system that openly permitted a wealthy aristocrat to systematically erase hundreds of vulnerable lower-class lives with absolute impunity. The real terror was always terrestrial, leaving behind nothing but the silent, snow-covered stones and a single rusted silver sewing needle resting quietly in the frozen dirt. If you were drawn to the sanitized lies of history and the chilling realities hidden beneath them, click the video on your screen right now to join our next investigation into the shadows, and make sure to subscribe so you never miss the truth.